A very warm welcome, dear listeners. You are listening to the DigiCompetence podcast with Anne Cork and Philip Ramin.
Yes, and today we are very honored to have with us a very special guest, someone who has not only shaped the course of policy in his home state, but has also been a relentless advocate for education at national level. I'm talking about Bob Wise, the former governor of West Virginia. Bob earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from Duke University. He went on to study law and earned a Juris Doctor degree from Tulane University School of Law. After obtaining his doctor degree, he worked as an attorney in private practice before entering politics. Bob went on to serve in the West Virginia State Senate and later represented West Virginia in the U.S. House of Representatives for 18 years, before becoming the 33rd governor of West Virginia from 2001 to 2005. Bob Wise has a passion for public service, and it didn't just start with him being the governor of West Virginia. It's been a lifelong commitment. Before taking the reins as governor, he represented the people of West Virginia in the U.S. Congress, and he was championing politics there, improving infrastructure, healthcare, and job opportunities. But what really stands out about Bob Wise is his unwavering dedication to education. Both during and after his time in office, as a governor, he pushed for reforms that strengthened West Virginia's public education system, working to increase funding and expanding access to resources for students across the state. After leaving office, he didn't slow down at all on this topic. Bob served as president of the Alliance for Excellent Education, AllFed, a Washington, D.C.-based national leader in advocating the policies and practices necessary for secondary school students to be ready for post-secondary education and careers. And the Alliance also is known for having led the development of future-ready schools, a network of 3,400 school districts, committed to the effective use of digital learning to assist teachers and improve student learning outcomes. Bob was one of the earliest voices calling for a focus on future skills like digital literacy and technology integration in the classroom, long before remote learning became a household term. He's also the co-founder of the Global Science of Learning Education Network, a collaborative network that brings together leading researchers, educators, policymakers, and philanthropists from all over the world, with the goal of applying the science of learning research to improving educational outcomes. Bob is also on the advisory board of the University of California, San Francisco Dyslexia Center. He's been an advocate for equity in education, ensuring that digital tools and innovations that are accessible to all students, regardless of their background or where they live. His aim is to help facilitate future-ready schools and future-ready learning. Beyond the world of policy and education, Bob is known as an avid outdoorsman. He loves hiking, is passionate about the beauty of his home state's Appalachian landscapes. He's also involved in conservation efforts to protect these natural resources, adding another layer to a rather multifaceted career. The fun fact about Bob is that his first election was in high school. Bob's motto is, "Education is the only passport from poverty." Welcome to our DigiCompetence podcast, Bob. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Amy. But I do want to point out that my first loss in electoral politics was in high school.
Practice makes perfect, Bob, as a losing an election. It's not a nice thing to happen, but it didn't deter you from going into politics, did it?
No, and indeed, that slogan that you just mentioned, education is the only passport from poverty, that was the slogan that my opponent used in that high school race. And I was so impressed by it that I took it. And when I ran for governor many, many years later, that's what I used. So I borrowed from my opponent.
And a real example from learning from failure, obviously. Great. Bob, obviously for us, it's not an everyday thing that we have a former governor of a state in the US as a guest. So I have to ask you, what was it like to have been a governor and go back to normal life? Did it take you long to get used to it?
Well, you have no choice. One day you're standing on the steps of the mansion. The next, you hand over the keys to the governor's mansion to your successor, to the next person coming in, and then a day later, I was in Washington D.C. interviewing for a job. But there was this moment when, because when you're governor of a state, you have a security detail. They drive you around everywhere, and it's usually every state has the same car, a Ford Crown Victoria, that they use, and I remember it was 2 days after I'd left office. I was interviewing for a job. I came out and I saw a black Ford Crown Victoria parked on the street in Washington, D.C. And I thought, oh, did they send that for me? And then I realized, no, I have to go get the taxi cab on the corner, all before Uber. But in a serious note, the thing about being a governor, I was in legislative bodies for 20 years. But as governor, what I valued about being governor was that governor is immediate cause and effect. It's like being a CEO of a company or a mayor, perhaps, of a city. But while you may represent a smaller constituency, West Virginia is 1.8 million people. When I was in the Congress of the United States, I was thinking about having to vote on interests of 320 million people. But you're involved directly in their everyday activities, and it's a 24/7 job. And plus that, when you pick up a telephone and call somebody in the state, particularly a state agency, you get results. So as a governor, what I valued about it was I could see much more direct impact. Whereas in the legislative body, and legislative bodies are critically important, it's a much more extended process. I remember being in Congress for about 6 months, and I was frustrated because I had an amendment to a bill and it wasn't going anywhere. And I remember running into a senior member of the Congress on the floor of the House of Representatives, and he said, "Bob, you look disappointed. What's wrong?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Chairman, my amendment's not moving very fast." And he looked at me and smiled and he said, "Son, don't come here if you cannot handle deferred gratification. You have to be prepared to be able to wait a long time." And that's the process. That's the legislative process versus the executive branch.
It's nice to know it's not only here that the people have to wait a long time
No, it is.
for
No,
things
it
to
is.
happen.
Legislative bodies are universal, because let's think about it for a second. Whether it's a lander, whether it's a parliament, whether a diet, the House of Representatives in the U.S., what you have is people coming from being elected from very different backgrounds in very different geographic regions. And so, for instance, in West Virginia, we would be heavily interested in coal, where someone from California may be interested in the wine industry. I don't know anything about wine. They don't know anything about coal. And yet we have to come to consensus on so many issues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, but where did your passion for education come from?
It really did come from, I was being facetious, but I'm also being serious. It really did come from growing up in West Virginia and seeing the power of education particularly in a state like many places in the world, but in a state that is undergoing a rapid transformation from the industries that it's had, the coal industry, the chemical industry, the manufacturing, steel, and so on, and having to watch the changes take place. And what I learned was that education truly was the only passport from poverty. It was the ticket up and out, hopefully up and in, that is keeping people in the state. But so the passion started very, very early. And I tried to make it a major point of my public life, the 24 years I was in office.
Well, both Philip and I, we love alliteration. So when we heard about your COVID constituency, that's a question that had to pop up. You said that COVID was a laboratory for the future of education.
Yes.
What did you mean by it?
Well, I could also say the crisis of the COVID constituency. So I've got 3 C's in there. Well, think about, and actually it was someone that I respect very much, Andreas Schleicher with the OECD, who pointed out to me that for just a moment, it was one big laboratory, because for at least a month, for several months, the entire world was undergoing the same experience in education. Almost all schools were shut down. 260, I'm sorry, 60 some million teachers were out. And so while we all come from different environments and different economic settings, we all had the same basic situation where parents were learning, having to take care of their children. They were learning the value and appreciation of teacher, what the teacher does. They were having to deal in varying ways with education. We all had to suddenly go from ground zero to 50,000 feet in terms of using technology in order to continue delivering education in some form. And we also, and here's where I grow a little frustrated, we also learned that we had to knock down a lot of government silos in order to provide the same level of, or even hopefully better services, because we saw our children's mental health begin to decline. And so the result was that this crisis of the pandemic provided us a chance to truly learn from each other across the world. That's why I got so involved in the Global Science of Learning Education Network, because for the first time we could see how the science of learning was necessary and could be applied in these situations. And so out of that, if you think about different countries and regions emerged in different ways, but we had a shared experience. And so with that shared experience, how can we have shared applications and shared solutions?
Bob, let me ask you some kind of provocative question. I mean, there's a lot of talk about education within politics, and very often I'm wondering, to what extent are politicians or representatives a kind of a role model when it comes to education and, investing time into learning? Because as we know, politicians are quite occupied with so many stuff to do, and very often it's quite difficult to learn on your own. So you get some kind of dependent to your stuff, providing the right speeches and protocols and all of that, writings. So do we also need to challenge ourselves that politicians need to spend more time on learning and being really at the forefront of these new topics?
When you said depending on staffs, I had to smile, Phil, because I don't think, at least in the United States, I don't think that our country appreciates how much policy is written by 27-year-olds. The staffs of the individual members of Congress and of the state legislatures and so on. I came to a realization, and that is that eventually every decision in education is going to be acted upon by an elected official. And what do I mean by that? Yes, whether it's in the United States, we have 14,000 elected school boards, school districts. Each one has a school board. So we start there. But then whether you go to the state legislature or the lander or the regional parliament, and usually they're voting on standards of some kind. They're usually setting budgets. They're setting requirements for teacher qualifications and so on. And then you go to the federal level, and you may have where you have sweeping legislation or funding programs. So whether it's a small or there are two places where important decisions are made every day. One is by millions of teachers in the classroom affecting students, but their ability to make those decisions is also affected by an elected official. So to get directly to your question is most of those in elected office, unless they come from education or they choose to spend their time on it, and I chose to because I thought that it was a necessity, but most are, as you say, having to deal with other topics. So I think that there isn't a recognition of the importance of education, particularly today, but there's also a need for all of us to keep advocating for what we believe is important in education. It's pretty hard to expect a member of a legislative body who has to vote maybe 8 times during the day on different issues, ranging from agriculture to defense to education to the economy, it's pretty hard to expect them, unless they're on an education committee, to be kept up to date, to be current on all of it. But so, what's the important thing? I do believe whatever the legislative body, wherever it is, a lot of people want to focus on coming to the Capitol to visit and make their case, and that's important. But I think, I'm behind me. I have a representation. I have a picture of the U.S. Capitol up, which we call Capitol Hill. So a lot of people they come to the Hill is the term. Well, I think the Hill visit is important. I think more important is the home visit. And so when that legislator is at home in his or her district or riding or wherever, whatever it is, that they are visiting their local schools and they're actually seeing what the impact of some of the decisions that they're making. That's what, and so I think that's critically important. When I became involved in working to help districts begin to make smart decisions, this was back in 2008, 2010, I began to work to help make districts make smart decisions and using technology. And I was fortunate. I had a call one day from Governor Jeb Bush of Florida, a Republican. He called me because I'm a Democrat, and he's been very influential and effective in education. And he said, can we work together to develop some principles that are nonpartisan, that every school district should use as it's considering how to adopt and implement rapidly emerging technology. And so we did. We created a digital learning council, and the result was that we were able to develop 10 principles, nonpartisan, on what smart things that you should be doing. And we got in a number of state legislatures, then adopted them. And so I think this is one way, is working in a nonpartisan way. And I stress that in the United States, is this isn't a Republican or Democratic issue. Education has nonpartisan solutions, and then preparing them so that the legislator can see them quickly and the staff can see them quickly, and most importantly, see how they would operate in their home district, in their home school.
Wow, that was a very detailed answer, and you
may have been more than you wanted.
Yeah, no. That's excellent. That's excellent, and it's. I think it's almost the answer maybe to my next question I have prepared, because in Europe and also in particular in Germany, we do have a very vital discussion about the role of the government when it comes to the future of education, and I think there are many perspectives on that, and I'm very curious about your perspective on that one.
Well, education is people don't like it necessarily, and sometimes it's not a good result, but education is a political process, and that's going to vary country to country. It is a political process in the United States, and like I say, the tradition started when, I like to say, with the covered wagon, as Europeans began to come to the United States and to move across it in covered wagons, where each group of wagons stopped, they would build a church and a one-room schoolhouse. And then they would elect a board, 5 people, to administer that. That's what's called the school board, and they'd hire somebody, the highest education, usually a 3rd grade education in the 1800s. But so we got started with local control, and second, electing school boards to essentially overlook the schools. Now, as education has become more sophisticated and obviously professional, school boards, if they're smart, recognize that they want to set broad goals, but leave the actual teaching and development of curriculum and so on to the people who've been trained to do it. Sometimes that works, sometimes not as much. But education is, and I think it's a political process for another reason. While some may say we don't take much interest in education, every legislator, every elected official is talking about their economy. And you can't talk about your economy today if you're not talking about education.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because one of the greatest needs, and we saw this during the pandemic, one of the greatest challenges was finding people qualified for the jobs that were were existing, but also now developing. And what we're seeing in the United States, I sit on an accrediting body for that issues that accredits institutions of higher education in a region of our country. And what we're seeing in higher education is that there's a move from the 2-year diploma or the 4-year degree or the graduate degree to getting a certificate in a certain area that gets me to the skill level I need for this particular job. And then when I want to go further, perhaps up in that skill, or I want to move to another area, I go and get another certificate. And so I think that what we're going to see in education for our future is not necessarily a constant continuing. I'm going for 2 years and to a community college or vocational school, or I'm going for 4 years to an institution of higher education. I think we're going to see layering on. I'm going to get this certificate. I'm going to get this one. I'm going to get this one. And I'm going to give you now, Phil, my last legislative agenda item that I hope, I don't know that I'll see while I'm on this mortal coil, but I hope this country moves towards it. And that is a lifelong learning account. We have Social Security for our senior citizens, but what I'd like to see is, because people are now so fluid in their jobs, I'd like to see government helping support them being able to move to any certificate they need at the time they need it.
Wow, that's a huge idea. That's huge.
Well, I think it's a very important one, and it's critical for a nation's economy.
Oh yeah, indeed. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about this lifelong learning idea, but a lot of talking so far, not so much action yet.
Yeah, well, there is a lot of talk, but we also have to be willing to put some money behind it. I mean, it's an investment. When I was with the Alliance for Excellent Education, we used to do a statistical. We do an economic analysis of each state. If they improve their high school graduation rate to a certain percentage, I think it was 90%. What would it mean in terms of increased economic activity? Because now these people are earning higher wages. Many more of them are going on to higher education and so on. And so this was an economic accelerator. Education is an economic accelerator. And particularly in an information-based economy, which is now moving past information-based, we have no choice. We have to be willing to make that investment. You make that investment as you should. You'd make that as a capital investment in terms of new equipment for a manufacturing plant, or for another enterprise buying computers for your office. We also need to be willing to make that investment in education.
Bob, making investments in education is making investments of money, but also time. I assume, and you've got, with your global science of learning education network, you seek to develop learning strategies and based on the way the brain learns, and share best practices. Do schools internationally share enough information with one another?
We're trying to develop that, and it's what one of the other co-founders calls the community square. The idea being that the educators, the administrators, the policymakers, the government officials all come together in a community square. And of course, very important in this, the researcher and scientists all coming together in the community square for a rapid exchange of that information. Here's my complaint, or here's my observations, is that there's a lot of good science that's been done about education, how the brain works, cognitive development, and so on. Science sits here, the educator sits here. Now, often there's what they call translation. So somebody takes the very hard to understand science and writes a book translating it for the educator. Problem is, translation's fine, but it doesn't lead you to implementation. And I'm about implementation. And so I've got a bookshelf with a lot of books of translation on it. But that doesn't mean that if I'm a hard-pressed teacher with not much time, that I'm able to spend time reading it myself. So the key is, and I focus on in the organization Global Science of Learning Education Network, or we call it GSOLEN, we focus on knowledge brokering. how do we move that knowledge to the educator, but more importantly, get it implemented? And also, let's make sure it's not a one-way street, because that educator it will develop areas that he or she needs or thinks are important to research, rather than simply depending upon what grant that researcher got. And so to me, it's a circle that needs to constantly be communicating with one another.
Mm-hmm.
Bob, I have to ask you, when I'm listening to you talk about all these different things, so many different perspectives on education, but looking at it from the outside, we see the US as being one of the most innovative countries in the world. Is there a secret in education that makes the people so innovative, in your opinion?
I think that one of the reasons I think we're innovative because, well, I can't, obviously then something is happening, but the thing about the United States is, I will say that if you want to pursue something, you may have to go get the education yourself. But but you're not going to be held back for the most part in trying to do the innovation you want. But I also note that a lot of it is homegrown, but a lot of it is based upon immigration. And much of our innovation has come from those who've chosen to come to the United States from some other country. And now I was talking to the Minister of Education in an Asian nation one time, who smiled and said, "You all are very innovative and you do wonderful research." Said the difference, that the reason that we're performing much better on the OECD assessments, PISA, Program for International Student Assessment. The reason we're doing much better than the US is we take your research and we actually apply it over a long period of time, whereas you take your research and you maybe use it for about 3 years and then move on to something else. And so, but I do think, but that innovative, what you mentioned, I think it's going to become even more important as worldwide, because AI is going to both take a lot of traditional occupations and applications that we've done. So in one way, it's going to be destructive, but in the other way, it's very constructive, because it's going to give people the opportunity to be really innovative. And we're going to have to be innovative in some ways to stay up and ahead of AI and to make the maximum and positive use of it.
I mean, in the context of AI, you have just mentioned, but also all the other drivers around, what do we need to change when it comes to schools, to universities, to the way we prepare young people for their future, and, providing also this new kind of data and digital literacy, for instance? Is our current system prepared for these topics and for these challenges around?
Most of our current system isn't moving there without a push. Some I think are what's that bell curve of you've got the early adapters, the early leaders, that's about 15% of any group. And then you've got a group that comes up here, that's the early adopters, I think they're called. That's about 35%. And then the bell curve goes down, and those are the folks that always run behind. So in any enterprise, you have a group of people who will be the leaders and the ones who will create things. And then the group I always focus on is that second group, the early adopters, or what do they call them? Majority adopters, I think, because that's the group that I call racing to be second. But once you get them moving, now you've got 35 to 40% of a field, of an enterprise, of an industry. Right. And once you've got them moving, now the others start coming along. And so that, I think, is what's important. A couple of things to recognize in education. COVID reinforced this and accelerated the process. First of all, people learn they can get their education in a lot of different ways. They don't always have to be in a fixed location called school. And so they also learned it was a 24/7 process, not a 8 o'clock to 3 p.m. Enterprise for K-12. They learned that for higher education, that getting a certificate may be what they want to do, as opposed to getting committing the finances and other in time to a 2 or 4 year degree. And also their economic situation may mandate that they do something, get a certificate, not lock themselves into a 2 year, 4 year program. Third is that there is rapidly developing technology, and I think COVID sped this process up. The fact that we're having this Zoom in a discussion right now, the rapidly developing technology that we need to be aware of, and I don't know about other parts of the world, but we're facing a challenge in the United States with teacher shortages in certain subject areas, recruiting teachers. And so, and the fourth one is we have a lot of people that, for whatever reason, need assistance in performing at the level that they're going to need to perform at grade level or in the job market. And so what are ways, and certainly there was an academic loss in many areas because of COVID. Students simply lost seat time, they lost learning time. So what is it that, how is it that we adjust to that and provide the tutoring? And once again, I think that's where technology and AI comes in. So I believe that there's a rapid transformation in education coming. Some of it's going to be driven by the public themselves saying, I don't have to do all of this that we used to do. I'd rather do it this way. I think some of it by innovators who are pointing out there are different ways to do things. And then I think the marketplace itself is going to force it, because the marketplace is going to say, I don't need to see a 4 year degree right away. I'm looking for these skills and this level of preparation. And then if you want to move up later, you can. So a lot of different drivers, I think, are going to force this, but it takes leadership by the educator to show what needs to be done. It takes attention by the researcher to provide what's the science of learning tell us, or the science of reading, for instance, about the best ways to learn, and then the policymaker to say, we got to, what may have worked at the University of Bologna 800 years ago may not be what we need today.
Bob, digital literacy is, everyone agrees, is just as important as traditional literacy. And a lot of the schools have the problem that if they teach digital skills, they have to sacrifice some of the core skills in the curriculum time that they have for learning, like math or reading. Do you have any tips how to avoid losing education while learning digital literacy?
I think digital literacy is critically important, but digital literacy, by definition, is literacy. And so,
what is it exactly? What is it, in fact?
Yeah, to me, I'm going to have to probably learn I'm going to have to read effectively in order to be able to become digitally literate. It's not just how I use the device and what I do on social media, but it's just like mathematics. Some people say, well, the science of reading doesn't really affect math. Well, it does, because there isn't much math that we do that doesn't have a word, isn't explained in words. So that's why I think that it should. I don't have a clear answer for you, Anne, except to say I've got to believe that smart minds, smart education minds can look and say, how do we combine literacy, the different literacy skills that are necessary, so that one is both literate in terms of basic reading ability, but also digitally as well. But I think, Philip, you also mentioned, so you have to define what is digital literacy too. And then when you define it, then it gets easier to dovetail it, to connect it to existing curricula.
I think we're talking about a moving target. First of all, things are changing, and personally, I tend to use more and more terms like future literacy or future skills, and being prepared for the future, because I mean, this kind of new literacy is not only linked to digitalization, to this, technological aspect, but also towards other trends, talking about sustainability, talking about other developments all around us. So more the question like, what kind of future skills do we need in different parts of society in order to succeed in our positions and roles, etc. So this is as well a moving target, but I think we need to challenge ourselves. About what are we actually talking about? Is it about the usage of tools, about tablets and smartphones, or is it about the way how we as humans want to interact with each other and how a society should work? So I see much more questions than just technological questions related to data science, for instance. So that's a little bit my view.
No, I think that's important. And I think it's important, isn't it, for another reason is when you talk about future skills, because 10 years ago, I kept hearing about how every child needs to learn coding.
Yeah, correct.
Now AI has come along and everyone's saying, that's obsolete. And so it is a moving target. But so I think you're right, and you want to identify. I think it's very important. I do some work with an organization here in the United States called the Hunt Institute that focuses on state policies. But one of the areas that we've been working on is we've been doing public surveys and polling since COVID, since 2021, on what the public is interested in, as opposed to sometimes what the politicians are necessarily talking about. Interestingly, in the United States, at least, what the public is saying it's interested in is, number one, the mental health of its students because of COVID and what they saw. But secondly, to your point, career-ready skills, and they define that as the ability to synthesize, to think and solve problems, to think critically, to be able to take three facts and come to a conclusion.
Yeah.
And this is going to be this is a universal, and I think almost will be a timeless need.
It's timeless.
Yeah.
That's the fun thing, actually. So we're talking about something related to the future, which has been relevant and important, from the very beginning of humankind, most probably.
The difference probably, yeah, absolutely. But the difference is that in the past, if we only had 10 to 20% of our population being able to do that, that's fine. They could be the supervisors. They could be, the rest of us would make good wages working on the assembly line or whatever. But that's no longer the case.
Right.
And today it's almost universal that everyone is going to need to be able to do this in order to be successful. But then that also gets to, as you're defining your future skills, it also, to me, gets to the personalization of learning and how technology can assist both the teacher, the parent, and others to identify, to help each student learn according to their ability to their abilities, to meet them. The saying is to meet them where they are. The best example I can give of this is I visited an Australian school system. This was 15 years ago, and I went to see the technology. And as I went into the high school, the principal pulled me aside and said, Wise, you came here to see the technology, but I want you to know that that's not the technology is important, but it's about what the teacher is now able to do. And he said, some people talk about teachers as being sages on the stage. Some talk about them being guides on the side, the idea of the teacher as a facilitator helping guide decision. He said, we don't look at it that way. We look at it as the teacher is, and these words I always remember, the teacher is an educational designer for each student. And now with this technology, with emerging technologies, that teacher has the tools to truly help the student design the best path for them to maximize their learning.
Bob, how do you learn?
I learn best by doing. I'm not so good at sitting down and reading, but I'm good at reading when it's something that now I need to know. And I really do think, and I say this seriously, YouTube is fantastic for me because it helps me immediately find some information about what I'm interested in. I never thought, for instance, I would be interested in how I would fix a drain in a sink. So I went to YouTube. So I went to YouTube to learn how to work on a certain mechanical aspect of a car. But I also go to YouTube to learn a lot about other topics that I now am interested in. And so we have to find what is it that a student is interested in, and then begin to adapt that education. And so one student who is interested in something has a mathematical background to it is going to learn math much quicker. But in learning math, they will have to become more literate in terms of reading, because you can't do math if you're not able to read. And so learning by doing is what works best for me. I know that probably I do it more of an extreme than others, but I do think that whether you call it project-based learning or capstone projects or so on, that learning by doing is critical to successive learning overall. Once again, that means that we have to individualize education, personalize education, not standardize it.
Yeah, also challenging ourselves, like what kind of learning formats are the right ones, in particular, taking into account like these learning objectives you have mentioned, like resilience, like critical thinking, like being open, being curious. I think many of the learning formats we do have in place today, may be in school and universities, may be in further education at companies, are quite formal, are more on an awareness level, but not on an action level, on a practice level.
Yeah.
And I think also the lines between skill and mindset are getting more and more blurry. So is curiosity something you can train, or is curiosity more something related to your social environment? So I think this is also something which is not crystal clear at this point.
Yeah, I think my first reaction is training curiosity is hard. I'd hate to have to come deal with a 30-year-old and say, I've got to train you to be curious. I hope that somebody along the way has helped them develop to be curious, that by making education an exciting experience, that then makes us curious to say, I'm interested in this, or I want to go down this path, or I'd like to look into this more.
I wonder, being a mother, what the role is of parents in making people curious. My son learned very, very, very young all of the numbers. And because he was so interested in numbers, we used to talk about numbers all the time. My next son wasn't interested in numbers at all, but he was interested in people. So we spoke about people all the time. What do you think is the role that a parent should be playing in waking up curiosity?
I hope the parent is able to engage with the child from the very beginning in doing exactly what you talked about. And yes, there are lots of situations where parents are single parents. They may work full time or have two jobs. Perhaps there's a grandparent that's taking care of that child. But how can we encourage parents and to be engaged with that child at every age, to awaken that curiosity, that interest, that spontaneity. So, I think the parent plays a critical role. Obviously, the research is very clear on that. The more parents read to their children, for instance, at an early age, the better that they are as they enter, as they enter kindergarten and preschools. But it really is important for that parent. And once again, is that an area that COVID show us that is that an area where it was necessary to help parents understand what they could do at home? Is that something that we school systems ought to be continuing?
Bob, we are coming to the end slowly, but before we come really to the end, we have our two final questions, one from Anne, one from my side. And my first last question, so to say, is thinking about your near future, the next, weeks and months, the next time, what are the top 3 priority topics for you? From a personal perspective, from a society perspective, you can choose how you answer the question. But what are your top priorities for the next time?
Top priority is to infuse the science of reading into the pedagogy and instruction practices and policies in the United States. We're making progress that way. But that so that then, because I think literacy is the key to opening up. And that's using, incidentally, not only science and reading, but also the science of math. So that's number one. Number two priority is, and I'm mentioning working with the Hunt Institute, is there are a number of issues that the public, or a number of topics that the public says they want to improve education. These are substantive issues: the career ready skills, mental health, personalized learning, safety in schools, and to make sure that policymakers at the local, state, and federal level understand this is what the public wants, and that there's support for that, as opposed to some of the more controversial issues that we've been dealing with in the US that aren't really advancing education, but just creating a lot of noise. So those are two. And I think that's
two are fine as well.
Yeah, at my age, I think that's probably about where I'll let it rest.
Two's great, Bob. I have the honor of asking
Lifelong
the last
learning account. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Yes,
that's
is
a good one.
advancing the concept of the lifelong learning account. So I got my 3 in.
Well, that's the most important one. Bob, I'll ask you the last question, and that is, if you were to look at the myriad of skills that there are to learn, and to pick 3 for the future that you'd advise people to learn now, which 3 would you pick?
Well, literacy is number one, and that's for all ages. So, I think that our education and our government systems need to be assisting people to become more literate at whatever age they are. So, I pick literacy, the development of career-ready skills, and the personalization of education. How can we support teachers? How do we support them at this technology to truly personalize education so that it becomes a curious experience, an engaging experience for every student, rather than one of I just got to show up and sit in class for 8 hours. Remember that the greatest reform can sometimes be your greatest impediment. And the best example of that is in the U.S. We created something called the Carnegie Seat Time, which is that a number of years ago they said all children have to be in class 180 days and have an hour a day on certain courses in their seat. In other words, how long you sat in a seat was what determined whether or not you got to move on. That's a Carnegie Seat Time. When was that created? 1906. It was good at the time because it required universal education. But now nobody goes to a car dealer and says, I want that car that took 180 days to build. Nothing less, nothing more, nothing less. We go and say, I want the car that's got the best preparation and construction. So that to me is how can we knock down some of what were reforms and necessary, and that now are impediments.
Bob, thank you so much. It was such an inspiring conversation. So many good points. Thanks for sharing all of your experience and your thoughts. And thanks for joining us today. It was a great privilege. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for what you all are doing.
Bob, I'd like to say thank you to the man who says you can't talk about the economy without talking about education, and the man who says it's time for lifelong learning to have a social security similar account that you can draw on to keep learning through life. Thank you very much, Bob. That was our conversation with Bob Wise, the former governor of West Virginia, an absolute advocate for education. And if you, dear listeners, would like to send us a suggestion for someone just as interesting as Bob was today, then please send us an email at podcast@i40.de. And with our hashtag DigiCompetence Podcast, you can follow what happens in our podcasts. And those of you who are with us more often know Philip and I will be doing somersaults again when you come to listen to us, when it's again Staying Digitally Competent with Philip Ramin and Anne Coag.